Hello and welcome, I'm JD and this is the update video for the modular missile update, the first major update for Nebulous Fleet Command. So we're going to go through all the changes in the change log that apply to you, break down a few different things. There are a lot of changes both to new content, updates to mechanics, balancing changes, changes to existing components, and quite a few quality of life enhancements. So stick around to the end, otherwise there are timestamps in the description below to jump to various elements of this video. So before we get started into the actual content updates, your fleets will be updated when you update the game. First of all, they will automatically rebalance to the new points cost for components. Check your power resource on each of the ships, as some of the components have gone up and down in power costs. So what you previously were able to do if you were near the power threshold, you may be over, you may need to tweak that. And also, as the MLS2 and the MLS3 launchers have now been removed from the game, if your ship contained an MLS2 launcher, that's going to be replaced with an empty VLS2. If you had an MLS3 launcher on your ship, that's going to be replaced with a CLS3, the canted launch system, which will also be empty. So you'll just have to go back through, re-add the missiles to those, readjust for that 3,000 point limit, and then jump into your first games. And so that's a perfect segue to jump into the modular missile update, new content features. All right, so this is the missile designer UI. You would have seen it from a few things such as the devlog, as well as a few other pieces that have been posted to date. All your previous missiles from the previous version of the game have been recreated, so you can immediately use these, or you can use them as a starting point in order to upgrade instead of having to build immediately from scratch, if that's the way that you want to go. It is broken up into a few different things. Missiles that are in your fleet will be located up here, and these are all your templates that are saved. So I can add a riposte up to the top by loading that template in. Then I'll have access to modify this, which if I then make any edits, I will then be able to revert changes, update the template, which will update this template here. I can duplicate it if I want to add something different between these two, if this was for one function and this was for another. If you want to remove this kind of missile from all of your ships, you can press remove missile and that'll remove that. You can create new missiles, so there are 5 new missile types in the game. If you come into create new, we have our size 1 missile being the Ballistra, which is your riposte size missile from the previous game. You have the Tempest, which was your main type of missile before. So your Hurricanes, your Gales are all based off the Tempest size 2 missile. The Pilum is your size 3 torpedo, so think of it as your mace. And then you have the other two being the hybrid missiles. So the size 2 hybrid missile has a size 1 missile on the front and a size 2 bus that will launch it. And then likewise for the size 3, that's a size 2 missile with a size 3 bus. So here we are, we're just going to create a size 2 missile. You'll then be presented with the template. You're able to rename it, redesignate it, change the color. So when you select the engine component, you'll be able to have control over speed, maneuverability, and range by moving around the slider. By selecting the middle part, you'll be able to add in the explosive charge. So the HE impact, which is your generic high explosive, your high explosive kinetic penetrator, which is designed for piercing heavy armor and doing extensive damage. So the faster it goes, the more damage it'll do. The blast fragmentation, which is your anti-missile type explosive. Then the blast fragmentation enhanced lethality, which is going to increase the damage for a couple more points. You can set the either direct or waypointable type avionics package. You must have one, as you saw previously with the warning. And if you choose either one of these, you have the ability to select offensive and defensive, hot or cold launch, whether it self-destructs once the target is lost, or if it continues its search. Does it have a terminal maneuver being either a weave or a corkscrew pattern? And does it approach from minimum angle? Does the missile continue to track in a straight line towards it? Or do you allow the missile to continue to head forward and then make a turn? Noting that if you select cruise, you won't have that final option there. If we have a look at the avionics configuration under the defensive role, you're able to change a number of different configurations for it. So you can set either size 1, 2, or 3 missiles to be engaged by changing it to green, and then whether the missile targets in an ascending order or a descending order. So for example, if you only want to engage threat sizes of the size 3 and the size 2 missile, and you want to target the size 3 missiles first, you can do size 3, then size 2, putting it to descend so it targets this way. or ascend so that it targets that way. You'll also be able to change how our point defense operates. So by selecting the different salvo sizes, like you would do for the PDMSL, you're also able to set the salvo size. Is it going to fire 1 missile, 2 missiles, or 3 missiles per incoming threat? And if you want to target missiles that are closer and then further, or if you want to target the far away missiles and then the nearest ones, depending on how you want to engage. So here, all these settings determine how you want to use defensive missiles in combination with your point defense opponents. So there is a change now also for this that supplements this really well. So when you're in a battle, the PDMSL option that is on the screen at the moment, when it has the fire mode doctrine and the salvo size doctrine, these are new features. So when you set these defensive settings under the avionics configuration, that's now considered the doctrine for the missiles. So if you change the PDMSL functions in game, that will override whatever you've set in the missile editor. If you have the doctrine set for fire mode and salvo size, you're going to use what you've set in the missile editor. Noting you can also now change all of the PDMSL settings at the same time by holding shift to give a group order and then simply selecting the PDMSL options that you want, and then like you would normally do for a formation order. There are a number of varying different seeker warheads that have been added. We have the command receiver, which was previously in the game. We have the fixed active radar seeker, again, same as what you'd be used to with the Thunderhead. But we also now have a steerable active radar seeker. It has the same vision and cone that a normal fixed active radar seeker would have. It'll rotate trying to find targets and therefore allowing you to cover a bit more of a wider area, even though it's got the same field of vision. You also have the steerable extended active radar seeker. So the same as the above, but it has a much larger range, so 5,000 as opposed to 2,000 meters, and it comes with a points cost associated. So we've got the fixed semi-active radar seeker, exactly the same as the Gale. The fixed anti-radiation seeker, which now will allow you to target all radar or simply jamming. So if you want to use it like a squall, it's going to be set as jamming. However, you can set it as all radar. So you'll actually be able to home in things such as search radars, fire control radars, and jamming signals at the same time. We also have the electro-optical seeker. This is an intelligence-based seeker. So once you get past identifying the type of warship using the intelligence mechanic, then this seeker is going to lock into that. So this missile will target the engines of a ship. And finally, for component options, not only can you add a validator, so a validator, once you add it in, you just click it across to validation. So this seeker here will check that this seeker here has the correct target based on what it is. And then if it is so, it will target. One thing to note when using creating riposte type missiles, if you turn on detect small targets, that'll allow you to take out other missiles. If you don't, this missile will only target ships. You also have the cold gas bottle, which will enable your cold launch missiles to operate a little bit faster, as well as your hot launch. You have the decoy launcher, which as it gets closer will throw out decoys ahead of it to tie up the ship's point defense and engaging it, allowing enough time for that missile to then get in and hit the target. You have the cluster decoy launcher. It's the same as the decoy launcher, but this one will fire 3 decoys and this one will fire 6. It also costs more points. You got the fast startup module, so the programming time will be decreased, but there is a failure rate where they may explode once they get out of the ship. You have hardens, giving your missiles more hit points. Radar coding will reduce signature size bonus, so point defense won't be able to lock on immediately when detecting it. You got the self-screening jammer, which will provide a little bit of jamming just in front of that missile. And then the same deal with a boosted self-screening jammer, which will do the same, but at a stronger jamming strength. Finally, everything is then summarized down here. So it tells you what type of avionics you have, your primary and your validation seekers. So how fast it goes. So this one's going at 215 meters per second for just under 10,000 meters, with its top speed being reached in 1.1 seconds. It has no terminal maneuvers. It'll give you all your how much armor it'll penetrate, how much component damage it'll do, and then its blast radius. And then finally, all the other points around the missile. So it's missile hit points, how long it takes to program. So smaller missiles will take less time to program, whereas larger missiles will take longer. Its signature size, how long it takes to boost, strafe, and then turn. And so just one other point on this, that the HE Kinetic Penetrator will always do 40% of its damage regardless of its speed. So even if you launch it at close range and it can't get up to its full velocity, it will still do some damage, but not as much as it would normally do. So we will do a more in-depth tutorial on this, how each of the Seeker heads can be used, the ins and outs of them. I'll even do some testing on which are the better support modules to use, or what scenarios you could potentially use certain missile combinations for. But that is a very quick, down and dirty how to use the missile designer. Build your first missiles, have fun with it, and then we'll do another tutorial. All right, so now that we've gone through all the different missiles, one of the other big mechanic changes related to missiles is the programming channels. Now, this has been discussed both through formal channels. However, it is good to cover here. Programming channels will determine how many missiles a single ship can fire at one time before the mount then has to go through a recycle time in which the next batch of missiles are programmed ready for launch. So this is for both hot and cold launch type missiles. And the main purpose of this was to eliminate missile spam. So instead of continually firing hundreds of missiles in a very long line from a vertical launch system, or by mounting a lot of the old MLS systems and rolling off 40 or 50 at a time, your ships will effectively use programming channels to limit that. Noting that you can still build a missile ship if you want to go heavy into what we are going to go through shortly. However, you do have to actually invest in that. As a result, vertical launch systems no longer have a compounding cost. Here you can see a VLS-2 launcher is 10 points. If I add another VLS-2 launcher, it is still 10 points. If I add a third, it is still 10 points. So the compounding cost has been removed because of the programming channel introduction into the game. Programming channels can be found for a ship under the weapons category. When you look for missile programming bus, you'll see how many channels that ship has with the organic number plus however many modifiers there are, as well as the programming speed for that hull. And then you'll see the VLS-2 or other missile types or the other missile launchers down below. Each hull will have one programming channel as a base. So the Sprinter will have one, the Reigns will have one, plus it has a bonus of one. So the green represents a bonus. So that's 2. The Keystone will have 2. The Voxer will have 3. The Axford will have 3. And the Solomon will have 1. Whilst we're talking about missile channels, it's time to have a look at the missile launchers. So the VLS-23, which used to contain your chaff and your ripostes, has now been split into the VLS-1-23 and the -146. So they cost the same amount of points. You can hold a double in this launcher. However, you notice the dimensions are different. The 2x2x2 can fit in basically any mount, whereas the 3x2x3 can only fit in select mount. So if we come across to the Corvette, I can only put a VLS-23 on the side here. However, I can put a VLS-46 or a VLS-23 on the front mount of a Corvette. Still, you'll be able to fill them with all decoys, chaff, flares, active decoys, as well as the size 1 missiles, whether they be offensive or defensive. The VLS-2 now replaces the VLS-16. These do auto scale. So if I come across to a larger ship here, just to give you a demonstration, if I put a VLS-2 on the side, that's going to give me a 16. That's going to give me a missile capacity of 16. If I put a VLS-2 on the front mount here, that's going to give me 80. And on the rear mount, that's going to give me 64. So the larger the mount size, the more missiles that you'll be able to put on there. So noting that just because it has 80 missiles that can be loaded into it, it doesn't mean you necessarily need to take 80 missiles. We also have the VLS-3, which replaces the MLS-3, as we said at the beginning of the video. Again, this one will resize. So 16 missiles on the largest mount. We have 16, so we have 16 on the largest mount, and if I was to put a VLS-3 on the side, you're only going to take 4. Additionally, you can also take the CLS-3, which is a new canted mount, which you would have seen. So this will fire in a forward-facing arc. You just need to be aware that in some of them, they will actually face backwards, depending on what type of ship you are mounting these on. So rear mounts, such as the rear mounts of battleships or as the light cruisers, are going to have the rear-facing CLS-3s. There is no penalty in terms of size. If you take a CLS-3 or a VLS-3, it really just depends. If you want something to do a hot launch, then maybe a CLS-3 is the better option for you. Also, one note for the VLS systems, ships will now have a check before they fire. So whether you're firing cold launch or hot launch, the ship will check to make sure that's not going to fire a missile straight into an asteroid. So when you're doing a cold launch, there's going to be a much smaller area that is checked above the mount as the missiles come out, rotate, and fire their engines. So the ship's going to check a much larger area around it if you're conducting a hot launch to make sure that it is firing the missiles in the correct area. So if your missiles aren't firing and you are right up against a rock, it's potentially this reason. So we've talked about programming channels. We've talked about the new mounts that you can fire missiles from. Let's go down and actually have a look at all the different components that you can use to buff programming channels. So under compartments, and you need a 6x1x8, we have the Strike Planning Center. It's 70 points, so it is fairly expensive. However, it is going to increase your programming speed quite a bit by 60%. So only your large ships are really going to be able to take this. I think potentially light cruisers and up. Let's just check across. Yep. So really your destroyers and up, because you can get a 6x1x8 on a destroyer. So if you come down to modules, you'll be able to add things in under the weapon support option. So you're going to have the ability for the missile parallel interface, so it's sort of like a Strike Planning Center, but it'll only do a 35% increase to your programming speed at 40 points. You have the missile programming bus, which will add another channel. So this, if I add a missile programming channel, we previously had 3, and we're now going to go to 4. And we also have a much larger missile programming bus array, which will add a +2. So if I replace the one we previously had, we went from +3, we're now at +5. Now, these are quite expensive, so that's 30 points, that's 50 points. So what I've gone ahead and done, I've added in the larger missile programming bus array. We've added in the smaller bus arrays as well. And we've added in a Strike Planning Center. So we can have on an Axford a total of 13 missiles at 160% speed. And that's effectively where you're going to top out. Noting that by doing that, I'm not able to take any additional engines, no additional power. We become quite constrained based on the limitations of the hull. So you may be able to do a few things maybe better with the light cruiser, but I think the heavy cruiser under this quick test that I just did will have the most. So there have been some hull changes. If we have a look at the Corvette to start with, its frontal mount 2 has been reduced in size. So it used to be from about there downwards, which allowed you to take a vertical launch system. That has been reduced now, so you will still be able to take small things such as the VLS 23. You can still take all your jammers, your bullseye, your pinards, etc., as well as a few of the different types of weapons. However, you won't get the VLS 2 anymore, which is the larger mount for the offensive size 2 missiles. So the Reigns has had a few changes as well. So mounts 3 and 4 are now larger. You can now mount a Mark 64 cannon on the top and bottom of a Reigns. It also opens up a few more point defense options, as well as the ability to take more missiles as well. So this is a good change for the frigate. It opens up a few more possibilities, both in terms of offensive capability, defensive capability, and it really solidifies itself as a missile platform, as it now has more missile cells than it previously did. So it used to have 16, it now has 24. You're going to get more missiles per module here now. So if we have a look at the Keystone, its hull modifier has changed. It now has a more power plant efficiency by 25%. So you're going to have more power on a destroyer straight off the bat before you need to start adding in additional micro reactors or power plant options. And one that you may all be very happy about if you've ever launched a torpedo into your bridge on the frontal mount of the battleship. This has been changed. The developers have gone in, they've changed the ship model. You can see the VLS here, how it is not centered on the white dotted lines like everything else usually is. That's because they've dragged it forward so that all missiles now being fired from a vertical launch system will clear the bridge, whether you're doing a cold launch or a hot launch. This has been fixed. This is a mount that is now viable to put a vertical launch system on and not having to worry about torpedoing yourself. There have been some changes to how the missile widget functions when firing on a track. By selecting a track and then onto the Thunderhead, which I have queued up, you'll now see straight off the bat up next to confirm, it'll say how many weapons in how many salvos. So as I queue up additional missiles by holding Alt, you'll see the weapon count goes up. This is referring to how many missiles I'm firing. and then it will work out how many salvos. So I have 2 programming channels on this frigate. As I add 3, it'll go 2 salvos, 4 is 2 salvos of 2 missiles, so on and so on as I go up. Again, whilst firing on a track, I can also add a full salvo at once. Now I use the caps lock key, but I think the default is holding left shift and left alt at the same time. Check your keybinds in your settings to add a full salvo. So by holding the caps lock key, you can see that the confirm has now changed to +1 salvo, and it tells you +2, which again is how many programming channels I have on this ship. So by holding caps lock and selecting 1 click, you'll see that I now have a full salvo. Now 2 salvos of 4, 3 salvos, 4 salvos, 5 salvos, 6 salvos, 7 salvos, etc. Now, this is probably not as important when firing with only 2 programming channels, but if you're really going for a missile-heavy build and you, for example, have an Axford that has up to, I think, 13 programming channels is its maximum, well, by adding a full salvo, that will add 13 missiles per click. So you don't have to just hold Alt and spam a bunch of clicks. Now, one other thing when you're firing directly on a track is the amount of clicks that you have queued up is how many missiles you will fire. If I select, say, 4 missiles to fire, what would previously occur is that would be 4, and when I pressed the next click in order to execute the order, it would add another one being 5. So if I queue up this missile now, so if I queue up that order, you can see that I'm now firing 4 missiles. When you're firing directly on a track, you will always fire the amount of missiles shown on the sphere widget tooltip. 6 weapons, 6 shots. A quick bug fix I'll interject here whilst I've got it displayed on the screen is that successive missile orders which use the same missile pool or launcher group used to cancel the order and override it. This will now queue up. So as you can see, I've fired 4 and then I've fired 6. This would have previously cancelled the first order, then only fired 6 missiles instead of firing the full 10. So a good fix there. One thing that I certainly hope is incorporated into a quality of life update in the near future. The same updates applied to firing a missile on a track are now fired for firing a positional missile. So if I fire 4 weapons here, it will still add the +1. Here you can see that we're now firing 5 missiles. I think that's just a little bit confusing between the two, but hopefully that gets fixed. Hopefully that gets fixed or updated soon. So if I just jump back slightly, if you are adding a full salvo to a direct fired track and you only have a salvo site and you only have 1 programming channel, that will just queue up 5 missiles instead. The missiles will now remember which direction they were flying in when a target is lost instead of returning to their original course. So this means if I was to fire a missile and it was to travel along this path and that the seeker required a track, previously what would have occurred if I had lost the track 7467, well, this missile would have reorientated back onto its original path and just kept going. What it'll do now is that if that track is lost, whether you're direct firing or positional firing, and the seeker has been able to acquire that target, I lose that track 7467, well, this missile is just going to continue to go and follow down the path that it was already going on. This is good for a couple reasons. If you lose the track, one, because 7467 has gone behind cover, then you do have the opportunity for this seeker to engage something. There is another ship that it can target that is behind it. It also means that if you are being jammed and then that jamming is lost, instead of having the missile return to its path and then the jamming end and you're able to actually be back on target, your missile will be in a good position to then re-engage its seeker and destroy that target, hopefully. So a fix that has also been implemented is that if I am firing on a track and the missile loses the track between the start of the launch animation and the missile taking control, it will now fly to the last location of the track instead of just simply going haywire and missing. So again, if we are waiting to fire this missile and we lose this track, then the missile will still continue to fire. However, it will now just travel along the path that was originally set, even if this light cruiser has gone somewhere else or that track is lost. Again, hoping that by the time it gets to that point, it has the ability to reacquire the track. So with these 2 fixes, ideally we are no longer wasting missiles simply because we are losing tracks in game, or because the tracks are being lost, we're not having the missile in the right position ready to reacquire. So one of the cool new features that has been implemented is that you can actually understand what your missiles are doing a little bit better now on the tactical map. Here I have 2 missiles in flight. If I select one of the missiles, it'll now demonstrate where that field of vision is, as well as what that missile is doing. So we can see here that the yellow line represents a seeker that has not acquired a target. And you can see the field of vision fairly well. If this was steerable, for example, you will see it rotate. You'll be able to understand what that missile is actually looking for. And if I come down to this Thunderhead down here, as it gets closer to the target, now that you can see that the seeker cone has actually snapped to green because it's been able to acquire these targets here. And now it's going to orientate itself in and move onto the track. So now it's actually going to be able to steer itself and engage these light cruisers. And so this has also taken one step a little bit further. If you have a missile and you have queued it up, you can see its waypoint prior to it being fired. If you now click on a missile and have a waypoint set, you'll be able to see what that waypoint is and where it's going to follow. So here we can see this Thunderhead missile actually following its waypoint. When it gets to its last waypoint, it should activate its seeker. There we go. The intelligence mechanic receives a new module. Come down to modules, under sensors, you can now add the ES32 Scryer, which is a missile identification system. So the Scryer missile identification system will tell you what type of missile is coming at you. So this is for local tracks only. So whatever the ship that you've mounted it on, whatever it can see, regardless of whether it's receiving the best track or not, is what missiles will be able to be identified. So to put it into perspective, if you put this on your battleship with a frontline radar up the very back, you will not see anything as it won't go across the comms network. Realistically, need to put this on something that has one of the larger sensor coverages, ideally something like your scouts with a spyglass, which will be able to see things at the maximum distances, have that better detection capabilities. You'll have a greater chance of using this system to identify what missiles are being fired at you, and or putting it on the ships that are most likely going to need to identify what the missile coming at them is. It may be worth actually taking it on a battleship so that you know what countermeasures to utilize. Or if you've got a pack of, say, light cruisers, you've got 3 light cruisers, you may want to take a Scryer on 1 or more of them so that missiles targeting the group that is designed to stay together, at least something will be able to see that. And so just a few things, it's got an intelligence accuracy of 0, so it'll always be 100%. You don't need to worry about that. So here, and ignore the battle over 20 seconds just because either ship has nothing on it. I'm launching 2 missiles off from one of these frigates. And if I just pause it here, you can see that the ship with the Scryer module has been able to identify this as an SGM-206 Thunderhead. And then with the intelligence, you can see that it is an active radar type missile. You'll be able to see this depending on what type of missiles are thrown at you. You'll be able to use this system to identify them and then take the appropriate countermeasures. This will become important with the decoys later on. The intelligence mechanic will now reveal a new piece of information to you regarding the ships once you've identified the condition percentage of the ships in question. You'll now be shown the percentage of functional PD on an enemy ship. So this will be based on how many are working. So if you have, for example, 4 defenders on a light cruiser and 2 of them are destroyed, the intelligence mechanic would tell you that the PD would be 50%. And then you'll have the accuracy modifier applied to that as well, depending on what type of component is providing the intelligence. So you may have a plus or minus, say, 15%. So if there are 4 defenders, 2 destroyed, the actual accuracy is 50%. However, with the modifier, you may have anywhere between, say, 35 and 65. Now, I believe this is just turrets. I haven't actually tested it down to that level. It certainly will be useful to take an intelligence center to understand what the PD status of enemy ships are, as it will be able to reveal and update this information the quickest. And you only need 1 per team. It isn't vital, however, it's certainly going to be a nice little addition. So having a look at point defense, there have been a number of new features and changes that come to just how they operate in general. So first of all, fire control radars on point defense turrets, so things such as the Aurora or the Defender, will now be able to lock onto missiles outside of the normal acquisition cycle. So the acquisition cycle occurs every second, where tracks can be gained or lost. We'll now be able to acquire a lock outside of that, which means the minute a missile enters their range and it is detected, they'll be able to then lock onto and start to engage. So no longer will you have the situation where a Defender or an Aurora continues to fire or doesn't fire at something that is coming at it because it's waiting for the acquisition lock to move on to the next missile. Additionally, there have been some background changes to the point defense logic. So it is now able to target for prediction a lot better to account for the target's acceleration. and the turret aiming logic will also improve. So not only is the turret going to be able to sort of predict where the missile is moving to, it's also going to account for the acceleration of that missile and then move the turret onto that target in order to engage. Small change, but a good change. A 20mm slug ammunition has been significantly reduced in size. Now you're going to be able to pack more of it into a magazine now that the defenders are a little bit more useful. The Mark 61 and the Mark 62 cannons, both 120mm in size, can now operate in a dual mode for point defense. So if you have one of these cannons on your ship and you've also loaded 120mm HE RPF into the magazine, if that turret is idle and is not under command by the player and a missile is detected by the ship, the cannons will automatically load 120mm HE RPF and then engage the missiles. However, you're going to have to manually go back into these cannons and change them back to HE AP in order to use them as normal cannons again to engage a small craft or other craft. You can obviously get around dual mode if you don't bring HE RPF. You don't need to worry about this. And if you do, just something to be aware of before you start to engage a smaller craft. HE RPF itself has had a bit of a bonus, both across the 120 and the 250. So the fuse proximity is going to work a little bit more. So you're going to likely see the RPF getting a few more hits, as well as there's an AoE explosion that has been added to the HE RPF so that it can reliably destroy missiles, and it'll still have those damage rays in order to impact corvettes and frigates. To compensate for the fact that it can now act in a dual mode role, the Mark 61 and the Mark 62 cannons have both had their traverse speed increased. So it's now 35 degrees instead of 25 degrees. You combine this with a mount gyro, you're going to be able to get up somewhere, I think around 45, maybe even 50% with a single one. So these turrets will be able to bear onto the missiles a lot faster than they previously could. Their auto loaders have both been reduced down to 1 as opposed to 2 and 4 respectively, as you can see on the screen. However, they've had a reload speed increase at the same time, which is quite significant for the Mark 62 and just over 50% for the Mark 61. So this has been done so that they continually put out a higher rate of fire in order to reliably put out HE RPF instead of putting out a burst and then waiting whilst the missiles still continue to track and you have to wait 15 seconds for the turrets to reload. If you are putting these on frigates or corvettes, just as in more of an offensive role, this also should help. Just make sure you're also adjusting all your ammunition calculations to support. This also helps with ammunition switching. Instead of having to wait 15 seconds to then fire HE or AP, you now only have to wait 4 seconds or 5 seconds respectively. Again, ammunition elevators will be able to decrease the reload speed, so you can potentially buff this quite quick, even getting it down to say 2 seconds for a Mark 62 to reload. We've had 2 new point defense turrets been added into the game. You have the Sarissa, which is a class 2 point defense turret at 65 points. It also costs 1250 kilowatts of power, so quite intensive. However, it can fire out to 6.25 kilometers. It will wait for a target to be acquired before it does start to fire, so you're not going to waste any shots. And combined with all the other targeting logic that has been updated, this is really going to help the Sarissa. The main purpose of the Sarissa, or its use case within the game, is to take out the size 2 hybrid and the size 3 hybrid missiles before they enter their sprint phase, where they're still fairly squishy and slow and consistent on their path. It does take a new type of ammunition, which is the 15mm ballistic magnetic, to make sure that you are giving it the proper ammunition type when in the game. The other option is that has been introduced is the Mark 29 Stonewall. So this is your barrier flak type point defense option. It has 40 points, size 2 as mentioned, only 40 kilowatts in power, so fairly cheap on the draw. It does have a great recycle time at 0.25 seconds with a autoloader capacity out of 100 and a reload time of 0.25. So you're pretty much always going to be firing rounds every 0.25 seconds, which is absolutely great. Ultimately, the use case for the Stonewall is to take out the smaller type missiles, so size 1s and size 2s, that are a little bit easier to hit because they have the reduced health pool, as opposed to things such as the size 3s, like a mace torpedo, which has a much higher HP. So the Stonewall will be using the 50mm flak just as the rebound. which while we're on the rebound, it's getting a points reduction down to 20 points, which was 30 points. So this will still be a size 1 mount, so you can use rebounds in order to support the stone wall, or you could use defenders, stone walls, and other types in order to have a more layered point defense. The flak round's going through a few changes as well. Its velocity is increasing to 650 meters per second, which it was from 500 meters. So from leaving the point defense turret to engaging the missile, it's going to reach there faster. Should be able to detonate closer to the missiles now. Its damage has increased to 15 from 11, so doing a little bit more damage on each burst. And it's got a larger radius, increased by 10 meters up to 50 meters. So it's going to have a much larger area. It's going to get there faster. It's going to do more damage. So I think flak is going to continue to be one of those things that is still a staple within the point defense network. A bit of a visual change, the flak is also going to remain for 5 frames on the screen, so you'll actually see the flak explosions remain a little bit more, just visually satisfying, and sort of something that you would see in the skies of World War II. So finally, a few changes to the Aurora. Its firing time has been decreased from 25 seconds down to 1.75, and the cooldown time has been reduced from 30 seconds down to 3.4. So overall, I think that's both a buff and a nerf depending on which way that you want to look at it. Changes in the use case now for the Aurora is really to target the missiles that are sprinting after they've detached from the hybrid's bus. So you'll be able to target a few sprinting missiles before it then goes into a cooldown. You're not going to have such a long firing time and such a long cooldown now. During testing, it did go through quite a few different changes. It now has had its overheat probability increase. So if you are battle shorting, expect to take more damage more frequently. And speaking of overheat damage, it's now increased from 10 to 14. That, and I think the biggest change that you'll really feel, however, is the fact that the power has increased. It's now 1250 kilowatts as opposed to 700. I think that's about like a 40% increase without doing the maths. If you have fleets that are Aurora heavy, really check the power because they're going to be drawing a lot more, even though it's the same points cost, and you're really going to feel it when building your fleets. The fire control lock has been increased to 3.25 kilometers. Even though the range remains at 3. So this will mean it'll be able to identify 0.25 kilometers out from its maximum range, acquire the lock, and then as that missile enters the 3,000 meter range to actually engage, you'll be able to start engaging straight away. Finally, like the Sarissa, it will wait for an acquired lock before firing. It won't just simply detect the missiles there and then start firing before acquiring the lock and then moving the beam onto the missile. We've had some changes to decoys and chaff. The chaff lifetime has now increased from 15 seconds to 45 seconds, so you won't need to necessarily dump as many as it will last a little bit longer. And also the TTGI, or the time to go intercept, is 30 seconds up from 20 seconds. So if you are firing chaff to go intercept a missile, that's how long it'll take. And then the refire time is how long it'll take to fire another one automatically without the player giving input. The flare decoy is a new decoy type, which will confuse any missiles that are looking for a wake signature. It will last 40 seconds, and it'll have a 20-second time to go intercept and a refire time of 10. Then we have the active decoy, which is the best decoy option within the game. Its costs are a little bit more per unit. However, you can use it on all radar as well as electro-optical and wake. So a 15-second time to go intercept, which is quite quick, and then a refire time of 20. It also will reflect a 1% of the incoming illumination power, which means it'll effectively appear to missiles as a 400 meter squared signature. So we do have a few new point defense decoy options to automatically deploy chaff as per normal. You have a manual, which will not deploy any chaff or decoys unless the player specifically tells it to. You have the ability to set least, which means only the lowest capability decoy necessary to defeat a given threat will be deployed. So for example, on this ship here, we have all 3 decoys. If we know there is a missile with a radar seeker coming to attack the ship, and we have this set to least, it'll only deploy chaff. However, if we set it to best, then it will deploy the active decoy, even though we had something cheaper that could have been used in its stead. So a few things to note here, that that's all based on understanding that you know what missile type is coming in. So if you don't know what missile type is coming at you, then you will just deploy all of the various types. So there is one more option for using decoys. Here you can see I've got a missile being targeted at me. I have a Scryer on my ship. So by right clicking, I should be able to select the decoy option, and only the relevant decoy will be fired. At the moment, I don't necessarily know why this isn't working for me. I think this is potentially user error. I will figure this out. I will show you how it works. I don't know why it's not working at the moment. So let me get back to you on that. It may not be a bug. It may just be me. I will figure it out. So a few changes to electronic warfare. Let's start with the floodlight and the spotlight illuminators. Both are now a flat 15 points each, opposed to the floodlight being 30 and the spotlight being 20. So it's going to be a lot more manageable to take these points wise, noting that the power remains unchanged. Also, the debuff modifier, which increased your radar signature, has been reduced down to a flat 10% each, as it was previously 20%, which was quite excessive for these two modules. So in addition to the above, illuminators now have a fall-off value applied to the power at the edge of the cone. So this means the chaff at the edges of the cone is going to have less impact and divert less of your missiles. So when it's reflecting the illumination onto the chaff. So this means you may want to use the illuminator and fire directly at a target as opposed to positional firing. A big change to the blanket jammers. First off, every time you bring a blanket jammer, that will increase your radar signature by plus 10%. So the more blanket jammers you put on a single hull, the larger the radar signature size is going to increase. This may not be as bad for things such as light cruisers, etc., but the smaller ships that were running around with multiple jammers, for example, frigates and corvettes, are definitely going to have their signature size amplified and be a little bit easier to detect now. However, the major change is the fact that jamming power now has diminishing returns. You can see the diminishing returns for each successive jammer on the screen at the moment, starting with the first jammer down to the 7th jammer where effectively it becomes a null and void. I think this is a good change for gameplay. There was a lot of times where it was just bring more blanket jammers to outjam your opponent, and you couldn't get any locks, you couldn't get any tracks, you effectively were just blind for most of the game. And when you've got 4 players on each team, basically everyone can bring a lot of jammers each. So it looks like by the time you apply the 4th jammer to a target, it's not going to be as efficient as the first 3. Nice little changes is that the interruption jammer has been reduced in its cost and its power demand, down to 55 points from 75, and its power down from 600 from 750. We'll likely see more interruption jammers on the battlefield. 75 points was a bit expensive. You really did have to pay that disco tax. It was quite high, but now this makes it a little bit more manageable for fleets to take. So one of the fixes for electronic warfare is that you used to be able to battle short in order to avoid the cooldown for a blanket jammer. You can't do that anymore. So here I have the blanket jammer. It has been expended. It is now cooling down. If I activate the battle short, it's still going to cycle down. You're going to need to battle short before the blanket jammer is fully used. So here, if I go, let me turn battle short off. If I fire the blanket again, and I can battle short before that is being used, but by the time I turn it off, it's going to remember where it was. And once again, once it hits its cooldown period, it doesn't matter how much battle shorting you do, you're not going to be able to interrupt that cooldown. Right, so there have been some changes to how offensive weapons operate, particularly a change with the overpenetration mechanic, which will affect railguns and all chemical weapons. So previously, if you had a railgun, depending at what distance its target was, depended on how far its rounds would penetrate into the target. So for example, you would generally always overpen a corvette and a frigate, unless that corvette was sitting around that 20,000 meter mark. This has all been replaced with internal armor density, which equates to a 1 meter of hull distance equaling 0.5 centimeters of internal armor. So what will occur now is when HE, AP, or a rail hits a ship, it'll calculate how much armor, how many centimeters of armor it has to bypass to enter the hull. It'll then work out the distance it can go based on the internal armor. If the distance culminates within the ship, then the full damage will be applied. If the distance is greater, so it's able to punch through the other side of the armor of the hull, then overpenetration damage will be applied. Let's have a look at 2 examples of this. So here we have a corvette. It has a 5 centimeters of external armor represented with the white lines. We are firing 250 millimeter AP shells at it, which has an armor penetration characteristic of 60 centimeters. And so what we're going to do is, hypothetically, because I haven't measured this, we're saying the blue dotted line is worth 40 meters of distance, which is 20 centimeters of internal density. So as the orange block represents the AP shell comes forward, it's going to enter through the 5 centimeters of one layer of armor. It's then going to travel as far as it can, at which point it's able to continually go through the internal armor, covering the 40 meters of distance. Now as the calculation has reached the other side of the hull, it will check to see if it can penetrate through another 5 centimeters, which it can. So in total, it's penetrated 30 centimeters from one side, crossed the internal distance, and penetrated the armor through the other side. And so there's 30 centimeters of armor penetration left, which results in an overpen. So when ammo overpens a hull, it doesn't do the full amount of damage. So we'll come to that on the individual ammo stats later on. If we were to look at something a little bit smaller, so 120 millimeter HE shells, it has 30 centimeters of armor penetration. With these same stats, going to be able to penetrate through 5 centimeters of Corvette hull. It'll then still be able to travel the distance, and once it gets to the other side of the hull, it's going to total 30 centimeters of armor penetration. Now at this point, and because of the calculation stats I've chosen, there's 0 AP left, which is not going to result in an overpenetration at all. So the full damage of that shell, of the 120 millimeter HE shell, is going to be applied to whatever it hits. We'll cover this more in detail, I think, in a later tutorial where we'll go through this in a lot more detail. However, if basically what you need to take away from this, if you're firing a large caliber round at a small ship, you're going to overpenetrate pretty much every time. And so if you're firing a large caliber at a large ship, you're not going to overpenetrate, you're going to be doing the full damage. And if you are firing a smaller caliber at something that is able to pierce a larger ship's hull, you're actually not going to be going too far in depth. So you're not going to be able to really get into those internals. If we have a look at the 450 millimeter family of ammunition first, the AP is getting a buff to 110 centimeters of armor penetration to account for this new mechanic. Also has an increased override search distance to 110 meters from 55, which, if memory serves me correctly, is the distance that the explosion of the shell will actually look to search for internal components to damage, has been decreased from 60% down to 30%. So adjusting for the fact that overpenetration isn't going to be as deadly. The 450 millimeter HE has gone up in damage, which is excellent, and the explosion radius has also been increased. If we come to the railguns have always been, in the developer's eye, seen as a support weapon. However, they have dominated the battlefield for a long time, being able to instantly knock out components. So the overpenetration mechanics will also impact them. So the 300 millimeter rail sabo armor penetration has been increased to 200 centimeters from 100 centimeters. So you're more likely to overpenetrate now than you previously did. However, its component damage has been reduced to 70, down from 175. So you're not anywhere near as much damage as you originally were. The overpenetration multiplier has also been increased to 0.4 as opposed to 0.15. So you will do more damage on the overpen, but you have less damage to do. So I think overall you have a net loss there. The rail sabo will also have its debuff multiplier increased to 2.5 from 1.5. So a debuff is things such as your atmosphere leaks, your fires, etc. And that's because the debuffs are getting a little bit of a damage increase themselves. So fire debuff damage has been increased to 10 from 5 every 30 seconds. Every 30 seconds, you'll take 10 damage until you put that fire out. And it'll spread more often than it used to, increasing it to 25% up from 15. There's a 1 in 4 chance that that fire debuff will spread, and then it'll do more damage. So if you're bringing things such as a Corvette without any DC, a couple rounds is more likely to proc a debuff than it previously did. It'll eventually just burn out as the fire spreads. The main bust short debuff also does 10 damage every 45 seconds. It previously did nothing. It was just a debuff that was applied and had to be fixed. And so also, just for awareness, criticals are a 5% chance inside that debuff chance. We're more likely to see criticals coming from rails as opposed to other damage characteristics, simply because the rail sabo debuff multiplier has gone up. Critical chance is your reactor explosions, your ammo cook-offs, etc. Still on the railguns, Mark 550 spinal railguns reload time has been decreased to 35 seconds as opposed to 45, so a good increase, and their spinal weapon aiming has been improved as well. Finally, the Mark 610 beam turret has had its points reduced to 80 points, down from 100, and its power from 3,500 down to 3,000. So a bit of a buff there for that. I think Weeble will be happy there. A few quality of life changes as well. Components with long names will have their text now resized on the damage control board, so you'll actually be able to understand what that is. So ammunition elevators have been reduced in size. You can see that the micro reactor as well. Where else can I have? Again, ammunition elevators, the DC locker, so DC locker large, so that you can see that. This will probably become also very noticeable on things such as the battleship, where there is a lot in there and it can be hard to see at a very quick glance what you're looking for, as some of it was cut off, magazine reinforced, for example. So that in itself, I think, is a really good change. It's going to make this a little bit easier to read in battle. We also now have the ability to order an evacuation from your ship. So to activate that, into your DC board, you're going to select order evacuation. Then you're going to need to click and hold for 3 seconds to confirm that order evacuation. So let's do that now. There you go. You can see that that ship is now destroyed. And if I unfreeze time, what you'll start to see is the magic smoke or the space oil, whatever you want to call it. It's now starting to come out. It'll be visible in a second. There you go. You can confirm that that ship is now dead. So why do you want to order an evacuation? Maybe you just don't want to have to deal with a ship that you know that you can't do anything on the map. It happens to me a few times where you've got a Corvette, for whatever reason, it can't move, you can't repair it. It really doesn't matter if I leave it hanging around. You can leave it on the battlefield, or you can now order an evacuation. Another change as well is, and I think this is one that I'm quite excited for, like the missiles that we showed earlier in the piece, we can now see who's firing at who by looking at the tactical map. Here you can see I fire my 250mm cannons, and likewise the enemy's firing at me. So this is going to make it really, really easy now to see who, especially in spectator mode, who's firing at who. Railguns and the chemical weapons will also work. I believe this also works for point defense. One final thing, I'm going to leave this frozen because a lot's going on here. It's previously when you had a ship selected and you came over to a different part of the map, when you came out of the tactical view by pressing spacebar or your keybind, what would have occurred is you would have actually snapped back to the ship in question. Not anymore. So now if I want to look at this side of the battlefield and I want to come out of tactical map whilst I have my ship selected, I'm actually just going to look at the space that I'm looking at. If we have a look at chat, so one of the issues that has been going on for a while is chat readability. So if I open the chat, if you had all chat and typed it in, you're going to see your name chat in all, and it would have been white. However, if you wanted to chat to your team, that turned it to purple. So by opening up the chat by pressing T and tabbing through to your team, if I now write a message to my team, what's going to occur is you will see that it's still the white text, so a lot easier to read on a number of different backgrounds. However, it'll now say team being your color, and your name will be highlighted. And when you've been looking for what messages have come from whom, make sure you're just checking that prefix there to make sure that it is your team color. If you are obviously on the orange team, that's going to be orange. So there was a bug in the previous version where the repair speed wasn't being applied to the workshop or to the damage control center. That has been fixed. All damage control components now provide the modifiers as stated on their unit card. So the starter fleets have been updated. The starter frigate fleet has been removed as it was never really a good starter fleet. We've still got ash, birch, oak, redwood, and willow, as well as epsilon, but now added in is both sycamore and hemlock. So both of these are focusing primarily on new missiles. So if you're a new player, definitely check out all these new starter fleets. The old ones have been updated as well. So get in there, test them out first, and then use them as a starting point for your fleet modifications if you so wish, and don't want to build from scratch straight away. So we've had some new tutorials being added. If you come into campaign tutorial, nice little fleet icon update there. It doesn't do anything else. I just thought I'd mention it. We do have lesson 7 and lesson 8, which is target reference points and how to defend your ships against missiles. So play both of those. You may learn something from them, even if you've played the game for a while. All right, so that's it for the changes for this update. There are a lot there. One final thing I will mention is that the AI has been reworked. You can have a look at that in the patch notes itself. They will now operate a little bit more efficiently when utilizing missiles, particularly modular missiles, so they won't just dump their missiles like they previously did at the first target that they saw. So the game should now be live. Hopefully you've watched this while the game has been updating, and enjoy the game. I'll see you in a couple of hours for the 1v1 between Mesa and Dragon at 12k each. All right. Thanks for watching and take care.